Hi, Chris. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hey, Grace, this is really fun to be here.
Okay, awesome. So to give the audience a little bit of your background, so obviously, like yesterday, I was like doing some research. You started your career in like consulting, and then like later on, you were working for a consumer tech company on subscription, and then later on, you started working in investing, and then now you're a partner at Madrona. Why don't we start with like what were some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that you kind of took to, you know, being a partner at Madrona today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one kind of fun theme from my career so far has basically been to be super curious about lots of different things. And so if you look at my, all the things I've done on my LinkedIn, it's not obvious that it should have led to doing a lot of AI plus biotech investing.
Mhm.
And yet here we are. And, I think one of the reasons is, just being curious about the different markets and areas where I've worked on. And so when I started in consulting, you get all sorts of different projects and tasks and different industries. And I did everything from ripping apart mattresses to thinking about, orphan cancer drugs and what those portfolio looks like and sort of everything in between. And so it was just a really interesting introduction to all of these different areas. And I think that's been a theme that's continued where just being curious about kind of the different things that I'm working on has led to a lot of fun paths to go down. And so that's wandered its way through trying to helping start a D2C subscription ML based clothing business in New York City, kind of in the height of the D2C boom, which is really fun. And we learned a lot. And then, obviously now here to Madrona, having invested in a bunch of categories, but really for the last 5 years, predominantly focusing on this convergence of, call it the computer sciences and compute and AI with biotech, which I've just found to be endlessly intellectually fascinating and frankly super difficult, but but really fun to be working on.
Totally. I want to maybe like start with like since you mentioned like we just chat about your background was like math and like literature and English, like so what how do you like self educate yourself into the biotech industry? Because I really felt like based off like the company that you have invested in recently, it's a it requires a lot of domain expertise. How do you kind of like on this journey to self-educate? Um, obviously speak with a lot of founders, but how do you kind of like quickly
Yeah.
understand how the ecosystem works?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is I just read a lot
Mhm,
and continue. And when we started this was basically had to start at the basic questions and ask friends and people in our network who were much deeper in the science than certainly I was, kind of
mhm,
about like what's going on here. And starting from a base network of that. I'm lucky I'm sitting here in Seattle. Madrona's had really long relationships with the University of Washington and the Fred Hutch Cancer Center. And so I had a nice
mhm,
unfair advantage of getting to go ask really smart scientists for free to
mhm,
explain things to me. And we'd just have these fun conversations. And so that's been one way, is just ask people an unbelievable amount of stupid questions
mhm,
and not be afraid to just continue to ask for things explained to you. The second piece is I have a bunch of amazing founders and CEOs that I now work with. And so I find that every time I talk to them, I just get a fire hose of super interesting insight and information. And of course, the
mhm,
challenge there is to understand and synthesize and, figure out like how to really think about that. But it's been awesome that now I get to talk about science and all of these innovations with a bunch of people who are just actively building it and doing it right now. But it is a technical and complicated space. I'd say the volume of just academic output is immense and not
mhm,
particularly possible for anyone to follow, right? And certainly
mhm,
the all-encompassing nature of it. And so one thing that I've done is pick a couple of areas where I do want to get really smart on. So,
mhm,
being here, protein design was a pretty natural place for that. We have
mhm,
the University of Washington and the Institute for Protein Design just down the street. And so that's been a really, so that was one area where we wanted to get really smart. And we had a bunch of people who we could go talk to and ask how it was, going and how it's working. That was one piece. Another piece that I wanted to get, really deep on was sort of the convergence of generating all of this biological data at scale. And when I say scale, I mean like incredible scale. So like petabytes of data a year type scale, and how you might, think about that as sort of compared to existing methods and also, potentially drug discovery. And so I tried to take narrower slices of, areas and companies that I was looking at where I had a little bit more familiarity with maybe the core infrastructure or the AI approach to it or the software that was happening, and then use that as a baseline to start learning the science. And so now, of course, I get to sit with founders and talk about maybe not all the nuances, but a lot of the nuances of targeting certain proteins and how you might make a therapeutic asset and, what these, potential products look like clinically. But it didn't start that way. It started with try to take pieces of what I knew, not being afraid to look really dumb in front of really smart people and trying to absorb as much information as I possibly could. And I think that's been a really fun learning journey for me. I find it endlessly fascinating, and I think I could just read a lot of the work that's going on just constantly. But that's been how I've done it. It's mostly been talking to really smart people, not being afraid to look dumb, continue to just try to learn and absorb as much as I can, and then explain it to myself so that or frankly, other people, right, who are not as, deep in the space anymore until it sounds logical and other people can understand it too.
Totally. I wanna double click on like the two things that you're focusing on. Like one part you mentioned about like the protein design part. Why don't we start there? Like what does protein design means right now? And then also how is AI kind of play into the picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's very timely because, 3 protein designers just won the Nobel Prize last week, including David Baker here in Seattle. And then, the 2 kind of lead authors on from DeepMind on the AlphaFold paper. And so, I think if we think about it, proteins are really just building, chains of amino acids, right? Which are just think about them as like the building blocks of, life or DNA. And they fold in interesting ways, and their folds have functionality, right? That exists in the body. And so you can think of people have probably seen the visualizations now, but these are basically like funny folding, and sometimes those folds change, and it's fun to go look at like all the cool stuff. And for a long time, up until the early 2000s, it wasn't clear that you could, de novo, right, just out of a chain of amino acids, design a protein that was functional. So like you could design some things that like maybe theoretically existed or like made fun shapes, but not in reality. But it wasn't clear that you could actually do this and get functional benefits out of it. And so, one of the milestones in the field was here kind of in the early 2000s at David Baker's lab at the Institute for Protein Design, where they did design the kind of first functional de novo protein. So from scratch, figured out how to build this, right, to be functional. And that was a huge breakthrough. And so then the challenge became, okay, well, if you know these chains of amino acids, can you then predict how these proteins will fold? And so that's where you had, this kind of competition going on around sort of predicting the folding accuracy. And that's where you got the AlphaFold models, kind of the Rosetta fold models, now the OpenFold models, people who have really unleashed deep learning and increasingly generative models on sort of these strings of amino acids to get kind of different folding structures. And so I would say that was like phase 2, right? Phase 1 was prove that you can actually design one. Phase 2 was prove that, from sort of inputs of amino acids, you can figure out what the structure of this protein would look like. And so that was fascinating. And I mean, 10 years ago, that didn't exist. Now, AlphaFold or one of these similar tools is largely in the workflow of so many, companies and scientists because it's such an amazing tool. And so I think that brings us to kind of where we are now, which is if you have all these tools at your disposal, if you have sort of the capability to, start to make these proteins to do things, well, then you can try to figure out really interesting things to do with the proteins. And so, one of the places where that's been very popular has been in antibody design, because antibodies are great therapeutics. And it's been, the traditional way to make them was sort of linear and, required discovery and then lots of chemistry. And now you can sort of input what you want, right, theoretically for this antibody to do, and whether it's bind to a specific target or have some specific function, and get a bunch of candidate designs of what that antibody could look like. And
Mm,
that's been a huge breakthrough. And we started to see this across a bunch of different categories. And that's been a huge breakthrough in kind of unleashing the toolkit of being able to build these proteins to, do things, right? So first we had to prove we could do it. And now, there's a bunch of companies and work out there that are proving that not only can you do it, but you can, design true therapeutic molecules
mhm,
that will eventually be put into patients and be successful. So I
mhm,
think that's been a huge, huge breakthrough. And AI has been a massive part of that story. So if you think about like the advances that AlphaFold, right, and that suite of
mhm,
models made, and now people pushing way past that into kind of applying a bunch of different generative models, right, using
mhm,
those underlying techniques. What's great? Proteins are a sequence of letters. Text models are pretty
mhm,
good at sequences of letters. I think that, that isn't the end all be all of where these models are now. I mean, so many people have pushed so far past that, but it's a really nicely set up program or sort of problem and paradigm for this design challenge. And so we're seeing people really unleash kind of the, generative capability of AI that's really only been in existence for the last 3 or 4 years, combined with the immense amount of compute available now, right, to actually run these models and getting really interesting results out of it. And so, that's been a space where I think the modern world of protein design, and increasingly then drugs that are developed from those proteins, it's not possible without this convergence of very capable AI, super high, powered compute, and all of that being available now to scientists to sort of run these problems. And so I
mhm.
think that's sort of how we've gotten here. And there's a bunch of companies working on, really incredible stuff. We've invested in several of them and are really excited about them. But it's amazing to see these tools in the hands of really smart scientists and being able to just do fundamentally different things than we could have even thought about even 5 or 10 years ago.
Mm. I wanted to learn more about like what's your thinking framework on like which I call it, I guess at this point we'll just call it like maybe generative science. I think we had like the punter from Obvious Venture came on the show.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of talked about like generative science and how AI could help drug discovery. I wonder when it comes to like, we just mentioned about like the protein design area. Like I wonder what does that mean for like a regular human? How do you commercialize the technology to for like a regular human to use on the day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the first part, generative science, the way I've thought about that is these tools need to be in the hands of amazing scientists,
Mhm,
period. And so it's not a case of AI is just magically going to design everything and like, hey, sorry, scientists, like you're done. That I don't think is happening. And I would be shocked
mhm,
if that happened anytime in the near future. It's just a
mhm,
hard problem. But on the other hand, you know, if you're a scientist and you're working on some of these really challenging problems, I mean, try to put every tool in front of you that can help move you faster and generate new insights and really advance the amazing parts of your work. So from that perspective, I'm ultra excited about kind of where generative science is going, because I hesitate to call them co-pilots because they're really not in this case, but
mhm,
using these tools in the context of people who've been doing this science for a long time and are really good at it. I think
mhm,
we don't even know what the sort of convergence and output of that is going to look like, but I'm excited about that.
mhm,
Um, as for regular people, when it comes to AI plus bio or AI plus life sciences, I mean, the product at the end of the day is really a therapeutic drug. So these
mhm,
companies, most of the companies are eventually focused on creating their own drug candidate and
mhm,
then trying to bring those through trials to treat disease. And so, when you think about AI for good, or sort of like the mission drivenness of
mhm,
a lot of these companies, putting amazing, highly effective drugs in front of patients and
mhm,
trying to get them in as many patients as possible. I mean, that's a great thing to do. There's a lot of
mhm,
risk involved in the process, but that's what a lot of these companies are going for. So from a regular person perspective, I absolutely think in the next 7 to 10 years, there will be drugs that have been designed predominantly by AI, or certainly with AI deeply in the loop, that are approved and will now be, used to treat cancers or autoimmune diseases or all of these, diseases that have been really difficult to, accelerate progress against. I 100% believe that. And so it might be a wait for, for the regular person for those to actually come out of the clinic, which I think is a good thing. But I think that's sort of the ultimate end product of what a lot of people are trying to do. On the model side, you can go play around with them. It's kind of hard to do unless you know a bunch about like proteins or, the underlying science. But you certainly can, I think, have a little bit more insight into the progress of what's going on, because, a lot of companies are pushing really hard, even just with open sourcing a lot of their work on sort of what the design process is looking like. And so, I think it's a little bit more transparent or will be more transparent as, more and more kind of AI is meshed into this process, sort of how, how these things are progressing. And I think we'll hear more about all of these companies and the breakthroughs they're making using AI. So from that perspective, I think it's just going to be a more common, thing to hear about, and sort of more common to hear about progress being made in a bunch of these spaces, at least until everybody gets bored of it, because it's just so ubiquitous that we're all using it. And so, but ultimately, right, the impact will be on patients, and it will be on, these companies who are really, really mission driven on, our goal is to put amazing medicines inside of patients. And we're using AI because we think it's the best way to get there. And so, that's, I think, where it's going to have massive outsized impact. In the near term, we'll get a lot more interesting, news and updates and visualizations, and hear more about these models becoming more and more powerful. And I think all that's on the path to, putting great medicines inside of patients who need them.
Okay, so I have hi Mincho, I will address your question in a little bit later. So I saw that, like, on the therapeutic side, it takes 1 to 3 billion and more than 10 years to like take a drug to market. Can you maybe give the general audience a little bit of background on, like, how does a drug from like discovery from like the lab on maybe the new like protein design like come to a fruition of like a kind of drug, and then what kind of tests do they have to go through before they launch into the market? And throughout the process, obviously there were investors that are investing in the making the lab more efficient. And then there is also the drug testing side. There's a lot of companies that are innovative in that space. And then there is on the go to market side, or like, I guess, software to help with accelerate like, I guess, like finalizing the drug.
Sure. Yeah. No,
So
I can.
how does this like how does the process kind of look like within 10 years from like, a test in like a lab to discovery, like to like eventually like the drug is like on the market? And then who are they selling it to? Is that like the doctor, the insurance company, the like hospital? Like, how does a kind of ecosystem work? And where does a 1 to 3 billion dollar actually goes into? Is that just the testing or discovery, or is this more towards like go to market, like giving the doctor some sort of benefit kind of thing?
Yeah, these are all really good questions, and I'm happy to kind of walk through what the process looks like. And I mean, I will say one reason it takes a long time, and I do think that generally speaking, people would like it to take less time for all sorts of reasons. But one reason it takes a long time, or two reasons, is because, like, first, it's pretty hard, right? Like, these are challenging scientific problems to solve. And once you solve the scientific problem, you then have to continue to iterate it on until you find, right, that drug that actually can fit all of the requirements of being put into humans. And that's not trivial, right? So there's a hard scientific problem, then there's another hard scientific problem. The other reason, right, why this takes a while is because I think the FDA, which is the kind of regulating agency in the US, is rightly concerned with making sure that the drugs that are out on the market are safe and efficacious. And so that is extended, right, some of the trial window a little bit as, as people continue to, work on making sure that the drugs that are out there are both, super efficacious and doing everything they say, but also very safe. And so that's kind of like, that's a little bit where the timeline comes from. But if you think about kind of the drug discovery continuum, I'd sort of put it into 3 large buckets. And I'll get to the kind of fourth, which is now you finally have an approved drug, like how do you go sell it in a little bit. But the first bucket is really like discovery. And so that's where, whether you're AI driven or science driven or, some combination of all of that, you have an insight around a disease, a specific target. So in this case, a target really means like a protein or something similar in the body that you're going to try to, whose behavior you're going to try to modulate. You can either kind of turn it up or turn it down or block it. There's some things that you can do, but you have a hypothesis around doing something to that protein or that target will affect the underlying disease in useful ways. And so, there's a bunch of, there's so many proteins, right? So there's a bunch of things that you can possibly go do. But that's sort of like what you start with. You have an idea around, if we make a drug for X target, it will probably have an effect on sort of Y disease. And so we'll start there. And so in the discovery process, depending on kind of your modality, and by here, by when I say modality here, I mean sort of what type of drug you're making. Are you making a small molecule? Are you making an antibody? Are you making a cell therapy? Are you making a gene therapy? The toolkit also has expanded a lot, right, in recent years of things that you can do. But in the discovery phase, you're trying to figure out if you can actually make that. So you're doing early work on saying, I can make a molecule or an antibody that binds or sticks, right, to this kind of protein target in a specific way, and it will modulate disease. And there's a bunch of ways that you can sort of do, the measurement of that and sort of how do you know? And there's a bunch of things that you have to figure out in that stage, right? Like, can you actually make a molecule that binds to the protein of interest? Does it bind enough? Does it bind in the presence of all sorts of other things that might be there? So it's a complicated combinatorial problem. And that is all kind of in the discovery phase. But it often starts with, we think that we have a hypothesis around why we should target this sort of combination of disease biology and protein target that we're going to go look at. There's been a bunch of AI in this space, and I hesitate to call it maybe pure AI, but lots of combinatorial approaches to say, well, we can try lots of things there. And so we can actually use the compute and the machine learning here as a hypothesis generation machine and try to filter out a lot of the stuff that doesn't work. So then again, we can focus our scientists' time on the things that might work. So there's been a lot of interesting, work in that space. That part of it, of the process, isn't that expensive. It's expensive, but like not really. Maybe $5, $10, $15 million, depending on how you're doing it. Some people spend more, some people spend less, but getting to there doesn't often cost a huge amount of money. It is extremely important though, because it de-risks it unlocks everything that kind of comes after that. The next phase, I would sort of say in this bucket, I'm sure there's drug discovery people and drug development people who would say it's much more nuanced than what I'm saying here, but I think this is, hopefully useful, is sort of the preclinical phase. So it's basically, the discovery and preclinical are kind of, there's a, somewhat along the same spectrum there, but the preclinical phase I would sort of define as, you have, what's called either a hit or a lead candidate or something that you feel like is pretty interesting on kind of that discovery work. And you're going to start to develop that into what will ultimately become a drug. And so the goal there is to go and figure out, how do you change or modulate all of the like therapeutic behaviors of your potential molecules so that you will be able to start phase 1 trials with it down the line. That phase can take a couple of years. It can take longer than that, depending on what you're doing. But you're really, you're iterating on sort of different changes that you're making to try to figure out, what does the activity look like? What does the distribution look like when you put it in more and more assays? So whether that's like mice or rats or larger animals, you're still seeing the effects, right, that you think you're seeing. You've got that whole phase where you're trying to iterate there. I'd say there's been some AI in this space. People are certainly trying to figure out how do you virtualize like the animal models side of this, so you don't have to just like use all of these. But that's the phase where you take sort of the output of that earlier discovery phase and you continue to mold it into what you will eventually, try to get to, the early start of trials. That phase is a bit more expensive because these animal studies can cost money and, time, and it's mostly expensive in time. You're going to, take a drug and you're going to do a study that is X months. And there's no real way to cut down right now on that, just like what that month's number is. And you tend to do these in serials. So you have to do one after the other after the other. So there's sort of time that is baked in there. And then there's sort of additional spend that is baked in there. If you can get sort of, out of that phase with all of the data being really good and, the toxicity is great, you feel like you don't have any issues with it, then you can basically take that potential drug, submit it to the FDA, and hopefully get approved to start clinical trials. And so, that discovery to preclinical phase can take years. I think that one of the goals of AI has been to cut time off of that. And I think you could, for sure, and people are definitely doing that, certainly on the beginning, right? Like, how do you cut time off of finding these sort of disease target molecule combinations that are going to be useful to push forward? I think the other part that AI is working on there is to find better drugs. So, hey, by the time we even put something into discover or into the preclinical phase, that drug has been better because we've found or starts better because we've iterated through all of these other things. So hopefully there it's smoother. And by the time we get to trials, it's even smoother. And so you've got teams working on faster, you've got teams working on better. I think most teams now would tell you they're trying to do both naturally, which would be great for everybody. And that cuts meaningful time off, right? If you cut a year or two off of that process out of a 10-year time frame, that's pretty good. I mean, that is, quicker to get things into market. But that discovery through end of preclinical, like getting into the clinic, it's expensive, but it's not wildly expensive. Where it starts to get really expensive is when you get into the clinic. And so that's where you start testing your drug in humans. And that's where everybody has heard about phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials, which is really like a gated system where you're trying to measure slightly different things that has been set up by the FDA, so that, right, you can eventually get your therapy approved. And that's the part that really still takes a lot of time. And there are ways, I think, to try to make that faster. There are different categories of drugs where that can be faster. Oncology drugs can have a faster path through that. Drugs for super severe, very rare diseases can have a faster path through that, mostly because there are no other treatment options. And so there's a lot of ethical incentive to try to, get treatments in front of patients. But it's time and it's money that you spend recruiting real human patients, figuring out the sites, getting doctors. And so that part, the AI drug discovery side of it has all happened before you get to the clinic. And by the time you get there, then, you're making sure that your study design is right. You're picking out the right patients, et cetera. And so there's a lot of opportunity actually. And if you talk to, really career drug developers who have gotten things through the clinic, a lot of them are excited about things that you can do at that stage. So how do you pick your patients better? If you know that your drug is actually going to be better for people who look like this subgroup or have this, like this specific gene, then there's a lot of work on, let's go try to find those patients, right? Because that's a higher likelihood of success rather than like, maybe we'll get some of them. There's been work, companies like Unlearn and others who have been trying to do synthetic control arms. So instead of having humans be the baseline placebo that you compare against, you can use AI for that, right? Because we should have a decent understanding of what things will look like without having to just test nothing, right, in humans. And so when you ask people like, that's where there's so much money. I mean, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's when the numbers can get up into the billions because people are running expensive trials, lots of them. In phase 3, the number of patients can be quite big. So you just spend a lot to actually do that. I mean, there's a lot that can go in there. And so when you think about it, a lot of these, the kind of AI plus life science companies that are working on the drug discovery and drug, like the actual building of therapeutics, like their work is all done up until the clinic. And there's a whole other set of companies, whether that's in trial design or patient recruitment or a bunch of things to streamline that's happening on this half. But there's a lot of time on the front and the back. There's just a lot of dollars that are spent in trials. And so people have really high incentives to get it right. And so that's kind of how that's sort of the maybe simplified version of that spectrum. Then when you get it to market, which again is often like 8 to 10 years, and many biotechs never actually commercialize their own drug, right? They've either been acquired or shut down before they get to that phase. When you get it to market, the nice thing is you know who the patients are. And so you've generally gotten your drug approved for, maybe first line, maybe second line, right? Like there's sort of a logical framework around when your drug is going to be used, which patients it's going to be used on, how many of them there are, who are the doctors. And so kind of like software, you build a sales team of, call it technical salespeople. So often people who are, somewhat deep on the science and the medical side of this, who then go out and sell. So they talk to doctors, they talk to payers, they talk to patient advocacy groups. The ultimate customer or user is obviously the patient, but they're not the person generally buying. And so, you have a sales force that's out there that's talking to the prescribers and the people who are actually going to be, using this drug to treat their patient. And you kind of run it like a sales team would be run in a software company. It's different, but that's about the same. And when you look at it, like, yeah, once you got a drug on the market, the margins are pretty good. The sales, cycle, the kind of the way you manage your sales force looks pretty good. And so a lot of that looks similar. And then, you have 7 to 10 years of patent protection, some maybe more in some cases, where nobody can infringe on your exact drug. And so the goal there is to sell, get lots of patients to use this and get them on treatment. So hopefully that was helpful. That's sort of how the spectrum works. And there's a lot of AI through kind of that whole clinical phase. There have obviously been companies built on the commercialization side of it. I spend a lot of my time thinking about everything before commercialization, but you've got the Vivas of the world. There's other companies that are trying to use AI to identify, the next doctors for sales teams to talk to, or to identify on the payers side, like what drugs are they going to be excited about, what price range, et cetera. And so you see this happening in kind of across all of this spectrum. But right now, the commercialized side of it is mostly the domain of larger, much more established, predominantly public companies. And for the most part, the startups and the venture-backed companies are all on the process of getting there.
I really love what you have shared. And honestly, as a human being, I feel like it's really scary to think about there are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, some human have to go through to be a drug tester for the rest of the society to make sure obviously they would be potentially being treated, but on the other hand, there's it's really scary to think about what kind of disease that's kind of unsolvable by the existing drugs. And I wonder when I want to go back to I think there's more than 90% of drug candidates fail along the way. As an investor, how do you kind of think about which part that you should put money in, and then which part, may not really generate the result that you need for the LPs or other investors that who backs in the whole process?
It's a good question. I think it's even probably slightly higher than 90% of drugs fail too, right? I mean, a lot of them fail because they just aren't efficacious enough. So you can get them to phase 2, and phase 2 is when you test sort of, does this drug meet the kind of therapeutic, requirements that we said it was going to? Did you reduce tumor volume or whatever your metric is? And a lot of drugs fail because they don't. So you get them through phase 1, they're safe-ish or safe enough, but then you get them to phase 2 and they don't work, or they don't work enough to be reasonable. And a lot of that's done by large pharma, right? So for them, it's actually okay to have sort of this, they'd like more to be successful, but it's okay for them to have this pipeline of things that eventually don't work in phase 2. From the investor standpoint, Where I sit is on kind of the seed and Series A side. So,
Mhm.
the thing that's most exciting to me right now is to partner with super awesome teams, probably from at least, some academic lab or connected to some academic lab, to help them start their company. And so
Mhm.
we're not, company incubators at Madrona in the sense that some other funds here are. So we're not going to come up with our own ideas and then, go find people to go build that. But we help people build when we can meet amazing scientists who've got great ideas and can help them build that company. So from a seed and Series A perspective, I think about it a lot as, are you going after categories or drug types or things that we can see in the market don't exist or need to exist. And so regardless of the risk that it takes to get there, of which there is a lot,
Mhm.
the ultimate reward for doing this is a lot of patients treated, a large market, et cetera. And that's easier said than done, right? Because everybody is
Mhm.
like trying to, generally speaking, do that. There are really competitive categories out there. I think a great example right now is all of the weight loss drugs and the GLP-1s and the
Mhm.
Ozempics of the world. There's always people make these really cool like circular market maps in
Mhm.
biotech world to show everything by phase, right? So it's like, hey, who has weight loss drugs targeting GLP-1 in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? There are so many weight loss drugs.
Mhm.
And it's great because people figure out it work, and so there's a lot of reasons to do that. But I think the key there was to be investing in that 6 or 7 years ago when nobody was looking at that as a target or saying like, hey, this is the
Mhm.
most exciting thing in the world. And so you have to be a little bit of a combination of, these are some spaces where we think we either have the ability to be first or to build something that is, really differentiated on targets that people care about. And, over the kind of 5 to 7 year time frame of getting that thing into the sort of middle of the clinic, we have enough sort of competitive advantage or, open path to get there. Other people, I think about this differently. There are certainly strategies to go right after existing drugs with just better versions of, better drugs in those same spaces. You tend to need a lot more money to do that, but it can be really successful. And so when we think about it from seed and Series A, we think about, hey, is your technology innovative? Is it pointed at a problem? I mean, this part is, I think, important, and it's been something that's changed. There was the early version of this, which was AI is going to do everything, so let's just invest in the AI. And then you talk to these
Mhm.
companies, and they're like, well, look, we're going to build AI for the next 2 or 3 years, and then we'll figure out what to do with it. I think that's changed a little bit, and we're certainly looking for companies who are saying, yes, we're excited and have built these powerful tools, but we also have something different and have a pretty strong hypothesis about what the product is going to look like.
Mhm.
And so it's almost like product market fit evaluation is just pushing the clock out. So it's to say, hey, if you were able to do this, is this, a compelling product to put on the market? Are there a
Mhm.
lot of patients? Does it serve an unmet need? Is it a valid, is it a market where there's other treatments or not? And
Mhm.
then if you work backwards from there, we'll try to evaluate, do we think we have an edge or a difference, or some real advantage of why we should be able to make, a specific drug to do that and nobody else can. And so, those I think are super interesting, questions that I use to frame it up. And it's early, so like we're trying to find combinations of novel technologies and drug and approaches to building drugs combined with some of these large markets and unanswered problems. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the ways we evaluate it. All of our investment is at the riskiest side, and so
Mhm.
I kind of think about, hey, by the time we get into clinic,
Mhm.
like we've done a lot of the work that we can do, at least from sort of where we play. And so we should try to get everything that's going to the clinic to be as good as possible. But there's still all of that that's coming after that. There are other investors that love to take that type of risk and jump in there. We're
Mhm.
really focused on helping people get there. And so making sure that, as you build the company, the sort of convergence of the technology and the products that you're building is going to get you there in the best possible way. And then the last thing I would add, one thing we do a lot of, and this has become maybe a more popular phrase, is sort of founder-led biotech. I mean, we're partnering with the teams who built the technology. And so often it's postdocs, or every once in a while it was the PI, the principal investigator themselves, who goes and runs the company. which is not as common in this world. There's a lot of kind of versions of it where you'll find interesting science, but you will um, find a professional CEO or team or whatever to go figure it out. We don't do that. Not really. We're focused on, the people who this was their life work to build this technology, and it's going to be their life work to build the company. And so we're making pretty big founder bets too on trying to find those teams that are going to do it. And so far, we've been really happy about that. And I'd say that maps to a lot of early stage venture from other categories, is finding the people who, like, for sure over the next 7 to 10 years are going to work as hard as they possibly can on this product, and because it's what they're doing and what they've been passionate about. So that's how we evaluate it. It's hard to evaluate, I'd say, like the clinical risk at the earliest stage way down the line, because we're so far away from there. But we hope that we get enough of it right in the interim and sort of in the beginning period of that, for sort of and as highly efficiently as we can, to make it so when we get there, we have a really high chance of success.
I wonder, like, what are something that you feel like are not an investable project? So, for example, like I would assume like there's a lot of investors who invest in Ozempic that may be like billionaires now, but at the very early stage, like sometimes I'll get like LinkedIn DM of like people trying to say, hey, like we're racing for like this drug discovery thing, and then we're coming out of like a really famous university. But on the other hand, I feel like it's very rare, like over 95% or like over 90%, or at least 90% of people will, or the team will fail. So I wonder, like, what would be something that you feel like are not going to be a good, like, from the investment perspective, to be like a good segment to consider?
Sure. I mean, I think there are some that have just been like hard, right? And they're hard through combinations of maybe the market just doesn't value them, that much. Maybe it's just complicated anyways. I think the canonical example there is sort of like antibiotics and infectious disease, like so incredibly important. And frankly, I actually enjoy talking to teams who are working on this, because somebody is going to crack it. But like, nobody seems to want to put any money behind that from the market side, right? And so those are things where, it can be very hard to come up with a compelling, investment thesis, because even if you make the drug, which is very expensive to do, you might not have as big of a market as you were hoping for. And to your point earlier, when you put hundreds of millions to $1 billion of R&D dollars into a product, and you got to have a pretty reasonable return from that. And so I think some of those categories have been difficult. There are categories that are tough right now, for sure, just because of competitive dynamics, and because I think maybe the breakthroughs haven't, quite gotten to the next step. So I'd say, cell therapy, as promising as it is, there are just so many cell therapy products in various stages of development, and they're very, very expensive. And so when you think about whether the economics of the actual, end drug work in relation to the market, plus in relation to the fact that there's lots of shots at this space, I think that's been a really hard place for people to play, unfortunately. I mean, I think we should all be excited about what the future of cell therapy could look like. I know a bunch of amazing entrepreneurs who are working on it, but it's just been challenging from a product perspective. And, the other thing that I would say that's been hard, which is not explicitly therapeutics, but is a category that AI has certainly, merged with in really good ways, is diagnostics. And, we've made some diagnostics investments. Diagnostics, again, super, super, super important. Like, we should all want to have the best diagnostic products out there, whether it's to figure out if you have COVID, which I guess you don't need to know much anymore, or, any type of different diseases, so you can get treated the best, right? Especially as, companies are making products like we talked about earlier, where they're really good for a specific type of patient. But diagnostics have been hard because they sort of combine the difficulty of building a therapeutic and getting that approved through the FDA. It's not quite as hard, but it's pretty hard, with the difficulty of building a hardware and consumery type business, or B2B or B2B2C. And so those categories, as amazing as some of the science we've seen is, they just can be hard to build in, because they're either structural forces or market forces behind them that make it tough. We're still excited to see those companies. I just think those are places where there's either economic realities of the market or competitive realities of the market that have made things hard. I'll give another example, which is we talked a lot about protein design earlier. One thing that people have kind of figured out is how to make antibodies. I'm sure there's a bunch of antibody engineers out there who are screaming about that. But people have figured out how to make antibodies. You can order antibodies. You can sort of get a lot of, these things to go target different, proteins in the body. And so therefore, because antibodies work great, there's a lot of ways to build an antibody therapeutic product. We're still really bullish on people who are doing that. But I think that maybe the pitch alone of we're going to use AI to design an antibody to do X on this one specific thing, it's very competitive right now. And so if you're going to go down that route, there has to be something different about your approach or your thesis or your hypothesis, right, for why that makes sense as a product. And so, although we're bullish about it, those are categories where like all of this technology has lowered the barrier to create molecules, right, for some of these things, which is societally amazing. And it makes it a little harder for companies who now know they've got lots of competitors if they figure out, various things about the drugs. And so I'd say those are just spaces that are hard. I have like one other space that's hard is small molecules. So think like not proteins, but things like Advil or aspirin that you can take in pill form. Super important because all things being equal, everybody would much prefer to take a pill than to have a drug injected into themselves or something similar. However, that's been tough, right? It's like AI has not worked as well in that space because it's not as clean and easy to model as proteins. And, small molecules are tiny, so they go in everywhere and they've got lots of different potential effects. And so, I say that having invested in a small molecule company, which I love and I think is amazing, called Terray, and it's doing really cool stuff. But even they would tell you it's a hard problem, right? So those are areas where again, like nobody's going to stop investing in small molecules. That would be wild. But people will say like, hey, you've got to have a much clearer version of sort of how does your approach map to where you think there is sort of competitive advantage in the market. And I think the nice thing about biotech in this context is if you contrast it to tech. So just take this next generation of AI investing in tech. They have two problems to solve, right? First problem is, does the AI work, right? Can you make this sort of science project basically work in a given use case or sort of for whatever you're trying to do? And then the second problem is, what is the product that I'm going to sell, right? How do I frame this thing into a real product? And so that's a hard double problem, right, to solve. And the people who solve it are going to be super successful. If you go to biotech, the nice thing is you can be pretty thoughtful about the market early. And so that if you get it right, you've probably got product market fit. Like you've probably found, hey, there's 200,000 patients out there where this is perfect, right, for what they're doing. And now I just have to make it. And making it is super hard, but I think you generally have a good sense of if you get to the end of the line there, that you probably have product market fit. You're just sort of hoping somebody doesn't beat you, right, with something that's maybe a little bit better. And so that clarifies the problem a little bit, right? Like the science is hard. You've got to build it. It's really hard. That's why we're excited about all these tools. But if you've been thoughtful early in the process and as you're thinking about your platforms, you should be able to get that product market fit part of it nailed well before you're even in the clinic. And so I think that's like it's a simplifying force on sort of how to think about these.
I wonder, since you just mentioned about like one of your portfolio company, Terray, like, can we talk about like, how did you kind of fund the company? What's your thought process on like the diligencing, something like this? And then, how do you think about like, I guess like, how do you evaluate the financial opportunity side of things? Since I feel like that's very hard from like the very early stage.
Yeah. Oh, it totally is. Terray's an awesome company. I mean, it's not just me talking my own book, even though I think that, obviously the world of them and have invested in and I'm on the board, but it's an awesome company taking a different approach to the space and generating, data at scale, which I think is just unprecedented in terms of just what they've done. When
Mhm.
I met Terray, it's a funny story. When I met Terray, it was right before COVID. I'd flown down to Pasadena, to Los Angeles, which is where they were,
Mhm.
in sort of a small office, and met with Jacob and Eli, who are the founders, and sort of heard this pitch of, kind of the high throughput, the most high throughput, highest data quality, right, sort of production technique for generating small molecule and drug target data. Like they're like, you know what we can do? We can we can screen hundreds of millions of compounds at a time,
Mhm.
and we can do it with incredible accuracy in ways that some of the other methods hadn't. And we were like, that's amazing. Like, that's
Mhm.
such a cool thing. And they had one chart. If Jacob is listening, which he's probably not, but he'll laugh about this because he and I laughed about this. They had one chart which had like 5 data points on it. And all the data points were lots of data points, but like 5 data points. And we were like, that
Mhm.
is awesome. Like, nobody else can do this.
Mhm.
And then, with them, we got into like, what's the vision? And the vision for them is they want to be like the true next gen large pharma company. So they have never been focused on, we're going to make one asset and that's it. And hopefully that's what we do. Like, they want a pipeline of lots of different programs coming through across disease areas, all small molecule, leveraging the sort of differentiated approach that our technology has to rapidly generate and design super, super good drugs from the beginning, or super good potential drugs from the beginning. But when we met them, it was, hey, we're doing this. Here's the chart. Nobody else can do this. It's really interesting. We have this big vision of what we want to go do. And then we had to bet. And our bet was that companies like Terray, who are combining this immense data generation, a huge amount of custom in-house AI that we've built, which we've had to because nobody else had built it, with incredible science. So when I talk about, scientists using AI tools, there's a lot of automation and AI in Terray, and yet you can walk around the lab and there's real scientists doing real work all the time, and they're using these tools, and you ask them and they're like, oh my God, this is like the coolest stuff in the world. And so, so when we met them first, it was being in love with the technology, being in love with the vision, like joining them and kind of seeing the path from how you can map that to making drugs at scale with high accuracy,
Mhm.
and like getting really excited about it. And we love the team. So obviously that was a huge part of it. As we move forward, and continue to invest in the company, I mean, the technology continues to accelerate at sort of a mind-blowing rate. And I always joke that every time I go to a board meeting, I just have to prepare myself to be blown away by something, because they always seem to have something that shows up. But it also becomes more about, okay, well, we've got 20 or 25 or whatever potential, programs that we could run in the pipeline. We've got these large partnerships with pharma companies, which have been published, where we're helping them on, different development efforts. How do we prioritize? And when we prioritize, how do we prioritize sort of the combination of products where we have a unique insight or ability to hit the target? It is a big market with need that we can understand, and we can really understand sort of the clinical path and how we would create a drug around that. So that's where we are now, and moving rapidly towards putting things into the clinic. And so it's becoming more about, okay, well, if we're going to prioritize this program, it's a combination of, the potential market size, the number of patients, as well as our ability to generate and continue and feel really good about our unique approach to this, specific target and disease. And so, whereas early on, when we first met them, it was, we're going to do all of that, and we have the best way to do all of that, and we can do it rapidly. And all of that was true. But when I first met Terray for the first time, they didn't sit down and say, hey, we're building a drug for this, so underwrite this, market, and we'll go from there. It was, we're building, the next generation large pharma company who's going to have marketed drugs across all of these important indications using our underlying, technology platform to do that. And we're going to go build that, and, together. And so that's how we got really excited about them. And
Mhm.
as we've gone further down, it's become a lot more about, okay, in the board meetings, let's figure out, of all of these potential products that we are in the process of making, which are the ones we need to prioritize. How do we resource them? How do we make sure that these are really, really compelling things that eventually will put on the market after we get through the clinic? And so
Mhm.
it's become more of an effort there. But the effort in the beginning was, let's use all of this stuff to do that. And we looked at a bunch of different types of companies in the space and just came to the conclusion that this was the one we liked the most and were most excited about for, from those convergence of factors. It's great. It gets to be, we talk just as much about software and AI sometimes as we do about chemistry and drug discovery. Although early on, the board decks used to have a 50-page chemistry addendum on them, which was just like literally just chemistry for 50 pages. And I don't think that was aimed at me, but yeah, that's how we kind of got to that one.
I want to learn more about like how do you define like the next generation large pharmaceutical company? So, I feel like there is obviously I feel like how are it different from like, the current existing solutions? So I would assume like in each big like pharmaceutical company there's like a different department doing different things, trying to figure out like the drug for like a specific subdomain.
Yeah.
I wonder like how are they differently from like the design perspective to solve this problem at scale?
Yeah, I think when people say, hey, we want to be like the next large pharma, I would contrast that against a company that says we want to build the best product for this, right?
Mhm.
So like, we're going to build the best product for kidney disease. We're going to build the best product or this specific kidney disease, or we're going to build like we like know this disease biology super well, so we're going to build a company to go target that. That's a really interesting thing to do and build, and those companies are super valuable. When you hear companies say, hey, we are like thinking of like what we want to do is be like 25 years from now be the next large pharma, I think it's a little bit to your point where they're saying the ultimate vision is to be able to leverage sort of our in-house technology, science, insight into all of these diseases to be able to play across whether it's disease areas or target areas, and build lots of products. So instead of, hey, we've got one drug that we're developing and maybe we'll get bought and so somebody else is going to go commercialize that, I think the vision really is we actually want to commercialize our first drug and we want to commercialize our seventh drug. And so by the time we're there, like our ambition is to sit across kind of all of these areas, leveraging our approach to doing that. And there's companies that have obviously done this. I would call like Alnylam and some others have done a good job leveraging, right, some of their underlying technology to be able to build, a broad surface area of different programs and kind of be more of a true pharma company. It takes a while to get there. I mean, it's not a 10-year bet. It's a 30-year bet, right? It's a very long time horizon to get these companies there. But I think that's what they mean. And the way they want to go about it is to say, we can be both a magnet for amazing scientific and drug development talent, and then we can provide that talent with the best possible tooling and data generation and AI infrastructure out there to help them do amazing science. And by the way, I think the pharma companies are thinking about this too. If you are a large pharma and you're not thinking about how do I make sure that my scientists have access to all these tools and it's in the workflow, I would be surprised. But I also think these new companies, given this kind of native DNA of science plus AI from the beginning, have a real shot to get there in a different way, because they were just designed that way and they were wired that way from the beginning. They don't have to add on the science. They don't have to add on the AI. And not all of them are going to make it. But I think that's how people really do think about it, which is if you look at the, take Amgen or Pfizer or some of these super large companies, we want to be like that. We want to have a division that can, really make these drugs at a consistent, pace and using our technology. And we want to be able to do that in another area too. I think that ambition is awesome. I think a lot of companies something else will happen along their journey, which will make them maybe not get all the way there. But some companies are going to get all the way there. And we should definitely bet on some of those doing that rather than everything's going to get acquired by large pharma.
I want to be mindful of the time. So I want to maybe like maybe we could quickly address the audience Mincho's question, and then we can like go for like a 1-minute fire round.
Sure.
Okay, so Mincho says it seems like there's a ton of interest around protein design and drug discovery. How are you thinking about this from a downstream standpoint? It's great that you can design and build a new bio product using AI, but do you see a gap in growing cells to produce these proteins at scale?
Totally. I think that the manufacturing methods, whether that's cells secreting the proteins or different ways to say make non-canonical, right, amino acids, especially on the biologic side, or just chemical synthesis of things like peptides. I mean, there's a long way to go to catch up with the, what's being done on the innovation side at the early stage. And a lot of these companies are worried about manufacturing, or they know that it's a problem they have to solve quickly. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity. I think, it's been the land of CDMOs, right, I guess, for a long time. And, there's plenty of other innovations out there that companies are looking at. We've certainly seen it from the, kind of the cell side. We've seen it from like next generation bioreactor side. We've seen it from non-canonical amino acid and to DNA synthesis, right? New ways to do that. So yes, I think there's an explosion of like need for those innovative manufacturing approaches. It's all got to converge at the same time, which is the sort of complicated part. But absolutely, I think that, as we get more and more advanced on all of these different types of products, like the manufacturing and production side of this at scale, it's one thing to do it in the lab at research scale, and it's another thing to figure out how to do it at real commercial and clinical scale. That's going to have to catch up too. And I think there's going to be a bunch of innovative companies that do it.
Amazing. Okay, so we're at the last 1 minute fire round for you. What's your favorite book?
My favorite book
You said
is
this in like the Coro podcast. You
what?
said this in the Madrona podcast before.
Okay, well, I'll say that I really like two. I like the complete short stories by Borges, and
Yeah.
I think that's probably my favorite book.
Yeah. So what's like a book that you're currently reading?
I'm reading a book by an Irish writer called Habitat that I picked up in Dublin when I was at my sister-in-law's wedding, and it's really weird and it's cool. And so that's what I'm reading right now.
Yeah, I like that you're like primarily reading the fictions than like the nonfictions, because I would imagine like all the business people are reading the nonfictions.
I don't read a lot of business books.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't hear Sapiens today. But anyway, so who made the biggest impact in your career?
In my career, I've had a bunch of mentors. Honestly, in my career, I'd say it was my senior year math thesis advisor who, which was on the early part of my career, but he set me up by saying, you're probably not smart enough to go to grad school, but you might be good enough to like understand things and explain them to other people, and you should figure out what to do with that. And so that, I think that was it was super impactful because it led me down this path of curiosity and diving deep into these areas and, following sort of instincts on understanding really cool stuff. And that just put me in touch with so many people and so many interesting people along the way.
I think I definitely feel like that's a really important trait, as like I think in right now in the AI universe, like everything is about like translation. Can you translate like a certain type of a really complex subject into like a real human language? I feel like that's a really like a superpower. So who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I invite to my dinner party? I could go in a strange direction on this one. I would probably invite John Coltrane, who's a jazz tenor saxophone player. Vladimir Nabokov, who's a really, really great writer. And maybe someone like it'd be fun to like have like a Richard Feynman there too. That's a weird group of people. But and Warren Buffett. I would love to hear what Warren Buffett has to say around the dinner
table. Where can we find you outside of work?
You can probably find me somewhere on the West Coast, but likely on the golf course. I love playing golf. It's super fun. I play with my wife, which is great. Or on the tennis court. Not really a hiker, but I do like playing, outdoor activities and playing sports. And so, those are things that I've found have been really fun to do with friends and family.
Amazing. Wow, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for giving us like a masterclass on therapeutic design.
It was fun. I really appreciate you having me, and hopefully it was helpful to everybody who's listening.
For sure. Let me quickly end stream.